And we made different choices earlier at different times in our history. Back in 1945, we emerged from World War II. We had all fought together. We had a debt GDP ratio of 130%. But did we say, oh, we're so indebted we can't afford to do anything? No, we said we have to grow. And everybody who had fought in the war, which was every able-bodied man, got a free college education. We could afford it. In fact, they thought we could not afford not to do it. And that was part of the basis of the fact that in the decades after World War II was our fastest rate of growth, and it was a shared prosperity.
And we built a highway system.
And then we built a highway system. We started having an anti-Sputnik, to compete on technology. We made a lot of public investments that led to this period of the most rapid economic growth and a period in which it was shared. Everybody grew, including the top, but the people at the bottom grew more than the people at the top, and the country grew together. As opposed to what's happened in the last 35 years, 40 years. I don't know how many of you know this, but median income means half above, half below. Adjusted for inflation, today in the United States is lower than it was a quarter century ago. Median income of a full-time male worker is lower than it was 40 years ago. We're not talking about the bottom, we're talking about the middle. And so we have an economic system that is not delivered in a fundamental sense for a majority of our citizens, now for going on a quarter century.
Joe, in the book, you blame the beginning of the growth of inequality on the Reagan administration. Tell us why you feel that way.
Well, it had to do with a whole set of reforms, so-called reforms, that began around there. And some of them began a little bit earlier in the Carter administration. But those reforms were labeled altogether supply side. The theory was that if we deregulated, we stripped away the regulations, we lowered taxes, that yes, we might get more inequality. Everybody recognized that. But the idea was that we would grow so much that even the people in the middle and the bottom, even if the relative share was going down, the size of their pie, the size of their slice would be getting bigger because the pie was getting bigger. Well, it didn't work out. The inequality turned out to be much, much bigger. The pie actually grew more slowly and with a lot more volatility. We didn't have any economic financial crisis from 1930 until 1980. And then we started stripping away the regulations, and we had the S&L crisis at the end of the 80s. Other countries that imitated us had crises too. So we brought back the crises. And in the end, as I say, it turns out not just the people at the bottom lost, even America's middle started losing.
But Joe, a lot of people, including I'm sure people in this room, think that government got too big. And the way to solve our problem is to reduce the size of government. And that is not only at the federal level, but the state and local level as well. And obviously you don't agree with that, but tell us what you think is wrong with that approach.
Well, it seems to me that the question isn't what is a mythical right size of the government. It depends on the circumstances, it depends on where you are. There is a concern about whether the government is doing the right thing, and I think that should be a big debate about whether it's doing the right thing. And there should be a debate about whether what it's doing, just look at a few things. You're not going to get infrastructure basically from the private sector. Airports, roads, and we
Why
have...
not privatize them?
Well, countries that have privatized it, like the UK, have found out why you don't privatize. They privatized the railroads, they had more accidents, less quality service. There's actually a complicated body of theory explaining why privatization typically doesn't work, why deregulation doesn't work. Let me give you one other example of the deregulation of electricity. Probably it's now slipped back into almost ancient history, but we had an electricity shortage. It was at the beginning of this century. We had an electricity shortage. It followed on deregulation. And everybody said, oh, it was because we have too many environmental regulation, too many, you know, this and that. It was too much government. And then we figured out what the source of the problem was. I don't know if you remember what it was. It was Enron manipulating electricity prices, which they could do because of the deregulation. They were playing all kinds of games and creating shortages to make themselves more profits. Guess what happened? We decided, let's go back to re-regulate. And what happened? No new capacity was built. All of a sudden, the shortages disappeared. So that's a really good example where you know, getting the government out of the way opened up a whole new area of market manipulation. If you think about innovation, let me give you another example. If you think about innovation, this is a good example where public-private partnership is important, but at the base of that partnership, there has to be government. Who did the basic, basic research that led to the internet, to the DNA, to the computer, you know, all the biotech? Almost all of that is government basic research. Even the first browser was financed by the US government. But of course, on top of that, we have a private sector which is very good at bringing it to the market, you know, adapting it, fine-tuning it. But the private sector would never make the kinds of big investments that are required, basic research that would have required to make the kinds of discovery that were involved in DNA. So the question isn't, as I say, isn't the overall size of the government, but how it does and what it does. So let me give you one more example that we've come to take for granted. Social Security. Old people depend on it, increasingly depend on it. Before we had Social Security, people could not get private annuities at any reasonable price. Still, they can't get annuities that have an inflation index feature in them. Really hard to get that. But you know what the administrative costs of Social Security are? They're just a couple percent. They're a fraction of what the private insurance companies take. Now, there are good reasons for that. The private insurance companies have large selling costs. The private insurance companies, one of the things, if you're a private insurance company and you're selling an annuity, what don't you want? You want to make sure the person's not going to live a long time. Because annuities sold to people who live a long time, you lose money. So you want to sell an annuity to somebody who isn't healthy. And there are lots of those around you, so you want to make sure they smoke and do other things that are bad for their health. But the point is that we need to have, in certain areas, an important role for government. And in the next phase of our growth, we'll need more, because we've been spending actually too little. And then there may be another episode where we will adjust the other way. So in my mind, what I look at, say in terms of investment, what is the real return to investments in technology, education, infrastructure, in the public sector, and let's compare that with the private sector. And the numbers that we get when we look at that in detail is that the public sector investments, with all the imperfections, are very, very high. And now, when the government can borrow at minus 1%, 2% real, it is really foolish not to undertake that. Now, that too, this topic too, is related to what I talk about in the book, and particularly in some of the essays at the end, because a major source of inequality in our society is unemployment. Unemployment, weak economic performance hurts, leads to more inequality, because not only the direct effect of unemployment, but it means that wages get bid down, and it means when the economy is weak, the public services that people in the middle and the bottom depend on get cut back, including, say, support for education, universities. So what has been happening in the United States? State aid to state schools, which are very important for access to universities, which are so important for our growth, is cut back. Tuition is going up. Tuition since 2008 has soared. Incomes have come down. And that's put a lot of ordinary American families into a real bind.